Marcus and Daniel Rodriguez had been digging for water for 3 days when their rusted shovel struck something that shouldn't exist. The sound was wrong, not the dull thud of hitting rock, but the hollow ring of metal meeting metal, deep beneath the drought-cracked earth of their failing ranch. What started as a desperate search for groundwater became the discovery that would make them millionaires. Black gold bubbled up from the fractured soil, transforming two brothers from the edge of bankruptcy into overnight legends. The oil field stretched for miles beneath their worthless land, worth more money than either man had ever dreamed possible. But oil wasn't the only thing buried in those depths. 20 feet below the crude, Marcus's flashlight illuminated something that made his blood run cold, a steel door marked with symbols that belonged to no government either brother recognized. What kind of experiment requires burial beneath an oil field to keep it hidden? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The metal placard gleamed under Marcus's trembling flashlight beam, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to mock their understanding. Daniel crouched beside his older brother, both men staring at the steel door that had no business existing 20 feet beneath their Texas ranch. "We should call someone," Marcus whispered, though he couldn't say who. The local sheriff barely had resources to handle drunk drivers, let alone whatever this represented. Daniel ran his calloused fingers along the door's edge, feeling for a handle or mechanism. "Call who? And tell them what? That we found a government bunker under our oil field?" The crude oil continued to seep from the fractured ground around them, creating dark pools that reflected their headlamps like black mirrors. 3 days ago, they'd been facing foreclosure. Now they stood above enough oil to buy half the county, yet neither man could stop staring at those cryptic symbols. "Look at this." Daniel pointed to a series of numbers etched below the main symbols. 1962. This thing's been down here for 60 years. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. 60 years ago, the government was doing all kinds of experiments. Nuclear tests, chemical weapons, psychological research. Nothing good got buried this deep unless someone desperately wanted it to stay hidden. "Maybe it's just an old fallout shelter," Marcus suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Rich folks used to build them during the Cold War, with government classification symbols on our land." Daniel's skepticism cut through the underground air. "Besides, look at the construction. This isn't some rich man's bunker. This is military grade. They discovered the door by accident, following an oil trail that led deeper than it should have. The initial strike had been 30 feet from their house, but the crude seemed to flow from this direction. When they'd cleared away the accumulated dirt and debris, the steel surface had emerged like a sleeping giant. "We need to see what's inside," Daniel said, his voice carrying the stubborn determination that had gotten them both in trouble since childhood. "Absolutely not." Marcus stepped back from the door. "Whatever's down there has been locked up for good reason. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, and some secrets explain why our worthless dirt suddenly turned into an oil field." Daniel found a crowbar in their equipment pile and wedged it against the door's seal. "Think about it, Marcus. We've lived here our whole lives. Dad farmed this land for 40 years before us. Nobody ever found oil because nobody ever dug this deep. What are the odds we just happened to pick the one spot with a government facility underneath?" The logic was unsettling. Their family had owned this land for 3 generations, struggling to grow crops in soil that seemed determined to remain barren. The decision to dig for water had been born of desperation, not strategy. Yet somehow they'd managed to find the exact location where oil and secrets converged. Marcus watched his brother work at the door seal, knowing he should stop him, but unable to ignore the questions multiplying in his mind. Why had their land remained worthless for so long? Why had no geological surveys ever detected this massive oil deposit? And why did those government symbols look freshly etched despite their 1962 date stamp? "There," Daniel said as the seal gave way with a soft hiss. "It's not even locked, just sealed against moisture." The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a staircase that descended into absolute darkness. Cool air flowed upward, carrying the antiseptic smell of a place that had been closed for decades, but somehow remained pristine. Marcus aimed his flashlight down the stairs, illuminating concrete walls that showed no signs of decay or water damage. Emergency lighting fixtures lined the walls, their modern design inconsistent with the 1962 date stamp above. "This doesn't make sense," Marcus murmured. "Those light fixtures are maybe 10 years old. Someone's been maintaining this place." Daniel was already starting down the stairs. Only one way to find out who. Against every instinct screaming in his head, Marcus followed his brother into the underground facility. The stairs descended much deeper than seemed necessary for any legitimate purpose. After 50 steps, they reached a landing with another door. This one marked with fresh warning signs in multiple languages. "Daniel, we need to leave. Now." But Daniel was already opening the second door. The black and white photographs scattered across their kitchen table told a story Marcus didn't want to believe. His hands shook as he picked up image after image, each one showing him and Daniel going about their daily routines with the casual clarity of professional surveillance. "This one's from last month," Daniel said, holding up a photo of himself fixing their tractor. "And this one's from Christmas, when we were visiting Maria's family." Marcus studied the pictures with growing dread. Someone had been watching them for months, maybe years. The photos showed intimate details of their lives. Daniel reading on the porch, Marcus working in their small vegetable garden, both brothers meeting with the bank manager about their mounting debts. "Where did you find these?" "And taped inside that old mailbox by the road. Someone wanted us to see them." Daniel's voice carried a forced calm that didn't match the tension in his shoulders. "There's more." He pulled out a manila envelope containing what appeared to be property surveys and geological reports dating back 20 years. The documents showed detailed analysis of their land's subsurface composition, including clear indicators of oil deposits that should have been discovered decades ago. "They knew," Marcus whispered. "They've known about the oil this whole time." The reports were signed by various geological consulting firms, but the letterheads all traced back to the same parent company, Meridian Resource Development. A quick internet search revealed Meridian as a subsidiary of Blackwater Industries, which was itself owned by a web of shell companies that disappeared into offshore accounts. Daniel spread the geological surveys across the table like a map of their betrayal. "Look at the dates. 1998, 2003, 2007, 2015. They've been studying our land every few years, watching us struggle, waiting for something." Waiting for what? Before Daniel could answer, headlights swept across their kitchen window. A black sedan pulled into their driveway, its occupants invisible behind tinted glass. Neither brother moved to look outside, both instinctively understanding that whoever had left the photographs was now ready for a direct conversation. The car sat in their driveway for 10 minutes, engine running, windows dark. Marcus felt like a mouse being studied by a cat that hadn't yet decided whether to pounce. Finally, the passenger door opened, and a woman in an expensive business suit approached their front door. Her knock was polite but insistent. When Marcus opened the door, she smiled with the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "Mr. Rodriguez, my name is Catherine Mills. I represent Meridian Resource Development. I believe you've discovered some of our property surveys." Marcus didn't invite her in, but she stepped past him anyway, her eyes quickly cataloguing the photographs spread across their kitchen table. Her smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered behind her professional facade. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding about your recent discovery. The oil deposit you've uncovered falls under existing mineral rights agreements that predate your family's ownership of this property." Daniel stood slowly, his farmer's hands clenched into fists. "Show me the paperwork." Catherine Mills opened her briefcase and produced a thick folder of legal documents. The contracts were dense with technical language, but the essential message was clear. Someone else owned the rights to anything found beneath their land. These agreements were filed with the county clerk's office in 1961, she explained. Your grandfather signed them when he purchased the property. The surface rights belonged to your family, but all subsurface mineral rights were retained by the federal government and subsequently transferred to Meridian through legitimate acquisition. Marcus scanned the documents, his mind racing. If you owned the mineral rights, why didn't you extract the oil years ago? The technology wasn't cost-effective for smaller deposits. Recent advances in hydraulic extraction have made this site economically viable. Her explanation was smooth, rehearsed. Of course, we're prepared to offer compensation for any inconvenience this discovery has caused your family. She produced another set of documents, a buyout agreement offering $2 million for immediate vacation of the property. The amount was generous enough to solve all their financial problems, but the timing felt like extortion. We need time to review these documents with our lawyer, Marcus said. Catherine's smile grew sharper. I'm afraid time is a luxury we can't afford. Environmental regulations require immediate containment of any oil leaks. If you're not prepared to sign today, we'll be forced to pursue emergency injunctions to protect the groundwater. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're running, but those photographs suggest you've been planning this conversation for a long time. I'm not sure what photographs you're referring to. The ones showing you've been watching us for years. The ones proving you knew about the oil deposit all along. Catherine Mills glanced at the scattered surveillance photos with apparent surprise, but Marcus caught the brief flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. She'd wanted them to find the photographs. This entire conversation was choreographed. Gentlemen, I suggest you accept our generous offer. Some discoveries carry complications that ordinary citizens aren't equipped to handle. After she left, the brothers sat in stunned silence, surrounded by evidence that their lives had been manipulated by forces they didn't understand. Sheriff Tom Bradley pushed the falsified land documents across his desk with trembling hands, his weathered face pale under the fluorescent lights of his small office. Marcus had known Tom for 20 years, had watched him coach Little League and organize community barbecues. But the man sitting across from him now looked like a stranger wearing his friend's uniform. I'm sorry, Marcus. I truly am. But there's nothing I can do. Daniel leaned forward in his chair, his voice tight with controlled anger. What do you mean there's nothing you can do? These documents are obvious forgeries. Look at the dates. They claim our grandfather sold mineral rights 3 years before he even bought the property. Tom's eyes darted toward the window, where a black SUV had been parked since they arrived. The county clerk's office says their records show these as legitimate transfers. Filed properly, notarized, everything in order. Then the county clerk is lying or being pressured. Marcus held up one of the forged documents. Tom, this is my grandfather's signature. I've seen it 1,000 times on family letters, birthday cards, his will. This isn't even close. The sheriff's radio crackled with routine traffic, but Tom jumped at the sound like it was gunfire. His nervousness was infectious, filling the small office with an atmosphere of barely controlled panic. Boys, I'm going to give you some advice as a friend, not as a law enforcement officer. Take whatever deal they're offering and walk away. Some fights aren't worth having. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Since when do you advise citizens to accept fraud? What happened to protect and serve? Since I got a call from the State Attorney General's office explaining that this matter involves national security concerns beyond local jurisdiction. Tom's voice dropped to a whisper. Since my pension got threatened and my wife started getting hang-up calls at 3 in the morning, the admission hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Marcus felt the last vestiges of his faith in the system crumble. If they couldn't trust local law enforcement, who could they turn to? Tom, what exactly did they tell you? The sheriff glanced again at the SUV outside, then opened his desk drawer and pulled out an official-looking letter on Department of Justice letterhead. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the essential message was clear: the Rodriguez property was subject to federal oversight under provisions of the National Security Act. They said your land contains sensitive materials related to ongoing national security operations. Any interference with the transfer of property rights could result in federal charges under the Espionage Act. Marcus read the letter twice, his mind struggling to process the implications. Espionage? Tom, we're farmers. What could we possibly know about espionage? It's not about what you know. It's about what you found. Tom's voice carried the resignation of a man who'd already surrendered. That underground facility you discovered? It's been classified since 1962. Even acknowledging its existence is supposedly a federal crime. Daniel slammed his fist on the desk. So we're supposed to pretend we never saw it? Pretend our own land doesn't belong to us? Before Tom could answer, the office door opened without a knock. A tall man in a dark suit entered with the confidence of someone accustomed to having doors opened for him. His face was unremarkable, except for pale blue eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. Sheriff Bradley, thank you for your cooperation. Gentlemen, my name is Agent Harrison with the Department of Homeland Security. I understand you have some concerns about recent developments on your property. Marcus felt his blood pressure spike. Our concerns are about fraud, forgery, and threats. Are you here to arrest someone or just intimidate us further? Agent Harrison smiled without warmth. I'm here to explain certain facts that might help you make informed decisions about your situation. The facility beneath your property contains materials that pose significant environmental and security risks. Our acquisition of mineral rights is designed to protect both your family and the surrounding community. By stealing our land, by preventing potentially catastrophic exposure to classified materials that were improperly disposed of during Cold War operations. Harrison's tone suggested he was explaining something to children. The oil deposit you discovered was artificially created as a containment system for radioactive waste from nuclear weapons testing. Disturbing that containment could contaminate groundwater for hundreds of miles. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Radioactive waste, contamination. Suddenly, the generous buyout offer made terrible sense. They weren't just stealing the land. They were saving the brothers from slow death by radiation poisoning. You're lying, Daniel said. But his voice lacked conviction. Harrison produced a radiation detector from his briefcase and activated it. The device immediately began clicking rapidly, its digital display showing readings that meant nothing to the brothers, but clearly indicated dangerous levels of contamination. The oil that bubbled up when you broke the containment seal. You've both been exposed to radiation levels that will require immediate medical treatment. Our buyout offer includes comprehensive healthcare coverage for radiation-related illnesses. Tom Bradley looked like he was going to be sick. Jesus Christ, Harrison. You let them get contaminated just to justify seizing their property. The agent's mask slipped slightly, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the bureaucratic facade. Sometimes national security requires difficult choices, Sheriff. The important thing now is limiting further exposure and containing the situation. Marcus stared at the clicking radiation detector, watching his future dissolve into medical bills and shortened lifespans. Elena Vasquez emerged from the shadows behind the abandoned gas station like a ghost materializing from memory. Marcus had driven here following cryptic directions scrawled on a napkin that appeared under his windshield wiper. Directions he'd almost thrown away before. Recognizing the desperation in his situation demanded considering. Even the most unlikely help, the woman approaching their truck moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. She appeared to be in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to catalogue threats and opportunities simultaneously. Most striking was the way she carried herself, alert but relaxed, like a predator confident in its environment. "You're the Rodriguez brothers," she said without preamble. "The ones who found more than oil under their land." Daniel tensed beside Marcus in the truck cab. "Who's asking?" Elena reached into her jacket slowly, producing a tarnished CIA identification badge that looked authentic despite its obvious age. The photograph showed a younger woman, with the same penetrating eyes, but the name and clearance levels had been deliberately obscured. Someone who knows what's really buried beneath your ranch. Someone who helped put it there 40 years ago. Marcus studied the badge, noting the sophisticated security features that would be difficult to forge. More importantly, he recognized something in Elena's expression, the same haunted quality he'd seen in veterans who carried secrets too heavy for normal conversation. "Get in," he said. Unlocking the truck's passenger door, Elena climbed into the cab with economical movements, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Drive toward the old railroad bridge, but take the service road. We need to talk somewhere. They can't listen. The same people who've been monitoring your family for 3 generations. The ones who built that facility under your land and have been waiting 60 years for someone to find it." Daniel twisted in his seat to face her. "Waiting for us specifically?" "Waiting for the right circumstances. Your family was placed on that land deliberately. Mr. Rodriguez, your grandfather didn't choose to buy that ranch. He was guided to it by people who needed guardians for something they couldn't officially acknowledge. The revelation hit Marcus like cold water. Guardians of what?" Elena was quiet until they reached the isolated service road she'd specified. When Marcus parked under the rusted railroad bridge, she finally spoke in a voice heavy with decades of suppressed guilt. "Project Mindbridge. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was the most ambitious psychological manipulation program the CIA ever attempted. We weren't just studying mind control, we were perfecting it." The words hung in the truck's cab like poison gas. Marcus felt his understanding of reality shift again, adding another layer of horror to their situation. "The underground facility isn't a nuclear waste storage site," Elena continued. "It's a research laboratory where we conducted experiments on human subjects between 1962 and 1975. The oil field was created artificially to hide evidence of what we did there." Daniel's voice was barely controlled. "What kind of experiments?" "Memory modification, personality restructuring, behavioral conditioning using techniques that would make Nazi doctors proud." Elena's professional composure cracked slightly. "We told ourselves we were protecting America from Soviet psychological warfare. In reality, we were torturing innocent people to satisfy our curiosity about the human mind." Marcus remembered Agent Harrison's radiation detector, the clicking that had convinced them they were contaminated. The radiation readings. Fake, a convenient lie to explain why you need immediate medical attention and isolation from the public. "There's no radioactive contamination, but there are things in that facility that could destroy careers and topple governments if they became public knowledge." Elena pulled out a small device that looked like a cell phone but emitted a faint electronic hum. "Signal jamming device. Gives us maybe 10 minutes before they triangulate our location. I need you to understand that everyone who's approached you, Sheriff Bradley, Agent Harrison, Catherine Mills, they're all part of a damage control operation that's been in place since the day the facility was sealed." "Why are you helping us?" "Because I was part of the team that selected your grandfather for relocation. We needed someone trustworthy to live above the facility. Someone who would unknowingly serve as an early warning system if anyone ever got too close to discovering what we'd buried." Elena's voice broke slightly. "Your family has been used as unwitting guards for 40 years. The least I can do is help you understand what you're guarding." She reached into her jacket again and produced a key card with magnetic stripping and security chips. "This will get you into the lower levels of the facility. The real evidence is there: film footage, medical records, audio recordings of the experiments. Everything they need to disappear to protect the people responsible. Marcus took the key card, feeling its weight in his palm. Why now? Why reveal this after 40 years? Because some of the subjects are still alive, still imprisoned in that facility, still suffering from experiments that were supposed to end decades ago. The electronic jamming device began beeping rapidly. Elena opened the truck door and prepared to disappear back into whatever shadows had hidden her for 4 decades. Wait, Daniel called. How do we contact you? You don't. From now on, assume every communication is monitored and every ally might be compromised. Trust no one except each other. She vanished into the gathering dusk, leaving the brothers alone with a key card and the terrible knowledge that their family had been manipulated by forces they were only beginning to understand. The classified research journal lay open on a metal table in what had once been Dr. Raymond Fletcher's private laboratory, its pages filled with handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed through 1963. Marcus held his flashlight steady while Daniel read aloud from passages that documented the systematic destruction of human minds. Subject: 47 shows remarkable resistance to memory modification protocols. Increased dosage of experimental compound LK9 produced temporary compliance, but subject reverted to baseline personality within 72 hours. Note: consider surgical intervention to damage hippocampus selectively. The sterile laboratory around them bore witness to decades of interrupted experiments. Gleaming equipment sat frozen mid-procedure, as if the researchers had simply stepped away for lunch and never returned. Microscopes remained focused on slides containing tissue samples that had somehow resisted decomposition. Computer terminals from various eras created a timeline of technological evolution, from 1960s mainframes to modern laptops that suggested recent activity. Elena's key card had granted them access to levels that existed nowhere in official building plans. They descended through security checkpoints that recorded their entry with electronic precision, and past chambers filled with monitoring equipment that tracked vital signs from subjects they couldn't see. Daniel turned pages in the journal with growing revulsion. Listen to this. Subject 23, age 16, demonstrates exceptional vulnerability to suggestion under hypnotic regression. Successfully implanted false memories of childhood trauma to create dissociative personality disorder. Subject now exhibits 3 distinct personalities, each unaware of the other's existence. Potential applications for deep cover intelligence operations promising. Marcus felt bile rise in his throat. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what they were reading. Deliberate torture, disguised as scientific research, performed on victims who'd been selected for their vulnerability. They were experimenting on children. Worse than that. Daniel pointed to a notation in the margin. Look at these acquisition notes. Subject obtained through family services cooperation. Official records indicate adoption placement. Actual destination classified. They were stealing kids from the foster system. The laboratory's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the preserved equipment look like instruments of torture. Which Marcus realized was exactly what they were. Devices designed to measure pain thresholds, monitor brain activity during psychological trauma, and record the systematic dismantling of human consciousness. Elena's voice echoed in his memory. Some of the subjects are still alive. They found the patient files in a climate-controlled archive that had been maintained with obsessive care. Hundreds of manila folders contained detailed records of individuals who'd been reduced to numbers and experimental variables. Photographs showed children and adults in various states of psychological distress, their eyes holding the hollow emptiness of minds that had been invaded and restructured. Marcus, look at this. Daniel held up a file marked Subject 78, Long-Term Observation. The photograph showed a woman in her 30s with familiar facial features, the same strong jaw and dark eyes that characterized the Rodriguez family. Does she look familiar to you? Marcus studied the photograph, feeling a chill of recognition. She looks like Aunt Rosa, Dad's sister who supposedly died in a car accident when we were kids. The file contained medical records dating from 1965 to the present day. Rosa Rodriguez had been subjected to experimental memory suppression techniques designed to create selective amnesia. The researchers had been particularly interested in her ability to resist complete personality dissolution, despite repeated chemical and psychological interventions. Current status. Subject remains in controlled environment. Level 7. Memory integration therapy has produced partial recovery of pre-treatment personality. Recommend continued observation to assess long-term stability of modified consciousness. Daniel's hands shook as he read the latest entry, dated just 6 months ago. She's still here. After 40 years, they're still experimenting on our aunt. The implications crashed over Marcus like a physical weight. Their family hadn't just been used as unwitting guards. They'd been victims of the very program they were protecting. Rosa Rodriguez hadn't died in any car accident. She'd been kidnapped and subjected to decades of psychological torture. Her existence erased from family memory through whatever techniques the researchers had perfected. We have to find her. Level 7, Daniel said, consulting a facility map they'd found posted behind the laboratory door. According to this, we're only on level 3. There are 4 more levels below us. They gathered the most damaging files in Fletcher's research journal, creating a paper trail of evidence that could expose the entire program. But evidence meant nothing if Rosa was still imprisoned somewhere in the depths of the facility. Still suffering from experiments that should have ended decades ago, the elevator to level 7 required additional security clearance. Elena's keycard activated the controls, but warning messages flashed across the display indicating their descent was being monitored and recorded. Whatever remained of Project Mindbridge's operation, they were about to encounter it directly. As the elevator descended, past levels marked only with numbers and biohazard symbols, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were entering a place where the normal rules of humanity had been suspended, where people like their aunt had been reduced to research subjects and kept alive solely for the advancement of psychological manipulation techniques. The elevator stopped at level 7 with a soft chime that sounded obscenely cheerful given their circumstances. The patient medical files scattered across the floor told stories that no amount of clinical language could sanitize. Marcus knelt among dozens of folders, each one documenting the systematic destruction of a human life, while Daniel examined what appeared to be a children's playroom that had been converted into an observation laboratory. Subject 12. Sarah Chen, age 8, Marcus read from one file. Acquired through manufactured family crisis. Parents convinced their daughter died in house fire they were hired to stage. Subject displays remarkable resilience to trauma-based conditioning. Recommend extended isolation therapy to achieve personality fragmentation. The photograph stapled to Sarah's file showed a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, entirely unaware that she was posing for what amounted to a prisoner identification photo. Below her picture, a progression of images documented her transformation over months of captivity, the bright smile fading to empty stares, then to the fractured expressions of someone whose mind had been deliberately broken into pieces. Daniel opened a door marked Recreation Area and immediately recoiled. The room beyond contained playground equipment that had been modified with restraint systems and monitoring devices. Swings equipped with straps and sensors, slides fitted with cameras, sandbox areas marked with observation grids. Even childhood play had been weaponized for psychological manipulation. They turned everything into an experiment, Daniel whispered. Even basic human interaction was data to be collected and analyzed. Marcus found Rosa's complete file buried beneath hundreds of others, its thickness indicating decades of continuous documentation. The early entries described a vibrant young woman who'd been working as a teacher when she'd volunteered for what she believed was a legitimate psychology study offering substantial payment for her struggling family. Initial interview confirms Subject's strong family bonds and protective instincts regarding younger siblings, he read. These emotional connections provide excellent leverage points for behavioral modification. Recommend exploiting maternal feelings toward nephews as primary control mechanism. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. The researchers hadn't just stolen Rosa. They'd studied her love for him and Daniel, then used those feelings to torture her more effectively. Every mention of her nephews had become a tool for inflicting psychological pain. Further entries documented Rosa's resistance to their techniques. Unlike many subjects who'd been broken within months, she'd maintained fragments of her original personality despite years of chemical treatments, electroshock therapy, and surgical interventions that skirted the edges of lobotomy. Subject demonstrates unusual ability to compartmentalize traumatic experiences, noted Dr. Fletcher in a 1970 entry. Despite extensive memory modification protocols, she continues to access pre-treatment personality structures during periods of reduced medication. Recommend investigating potential genetic factors that might contribute to psychological resilience. Daniel found a viewing window that looked into what appeared to be a residential area designed to mimic normal living conditions. Beyond the glass, he could see apartments furnished with period-appropriate decorations from different decades, as if the researchers had been studying how environmental cues affected their subjects' psychological states. Marcus. There are people in there. Marcus joined his brother at the observation window. In one of the mock apartments, an elderly man sat at a kitchen table, methodically folding and refolding a newspaper as if the repetitive motion provided comfort. In another unit, a woman Daniel's age tended to houseplants with obsessive care, speaking to them in a whisper they couldn't hear through the soundproof glass. How many of them are there? Daniel counted the visible apartments. I can see at least 12 units, if they're all occupied. He trailed off, unable to complete the calculation of human suffering they were witnessing. A movement in one of the apartments caught Marcus's attention. A woman with graying hair and familiar features stood at her window, staring directly at them with eyes that held both recognition and desperate hope. Even after 40 years of captivity and psychological manipulation, Rosa Rodriguez retained enough of herself to recognize her nephews. She pressed her hand against the glass and mouthed words they couldn't hear but could easily understand. "Help me!" Marcus felt something break inside his chest. For 4 decades, while he and Daniel had struggled to make their ranch profitable, while they'd worried about mortgage payments and crop failures, their aunt had been imprisoned just beneath their feet, subjected to experiments that had stolen her life one memory at a time. "We're getting her out of here," he said. "How?" "This entire level is monitored. The moment we try to access those residential units, security will respond." Marcus studied the facility map they'd been carrying, noting emergency exits and maintenance corridors that might provide alternative routes. Elena said some of the subjects were still alive. She didn't say they were unreachable. Before Daniel could respond, an alarm began sounding throughout the facility. Red lights flashed in the corridors, and automated announcements echoed from hidden speakers. Unauthorized access detected on Level 7. Lockdown procedures initiated. All personnel report to designated security stations. Through the observation window, they watched Rosa and the other subjects react to the alarm with trained compliance, moving to specific locations in their apartments and assuming positions that suggested decades of conditioning. Whatever experiments continued in this place, the subjects had been taught exactly how to respond to security alerts. "We need to move," Daniel said. "If they're locking down the facility," the elevator they'd used to reach Level 7 emitted an electronic beep and went dark. Above them, the sound of heavy boots suggested that security teams were already mobilizing to contain whatever breach had triggered the alert. The modern surveillance equipment hummed with electronic precision throughout corridors that supposedly hadn't been active since 1975. Marcus crouched behind a bank of monitoring stations, watching digital displays that tracked heart rates, brain activity, and behavioral patterns of subjects who were officially listed as deceased in government records. "Look at these timestamps," Daniel whispered, pointing to data feeds that updated in real time. "This equipment is recording everything that's happening right now. Someone's been actively monitoring these people for decades. The surveillance system was sophisticated beyond anything they'd expected to find in a supposedly abandoned facility. High-definition cameras provided multiple angles of each residential unit, while biometric sensors tracked every physiological response of the imprisoned subjects. Most disturbing were the psychological evaluation programs running on nearby computers, analyzing behavioral patterns and recommending modifications to each subject's treatment regimen. Marcus accessed one of the workstations using Elena's keycard, discovering files that documented continuous experimentation well into the present day. The research had evolved beyond the crude techniques described in Dr. Fletcher's journal, incorporating advances in neuroscience and pharmaceutical manipulation that made the original program look primitive by comparison. Subject 78 Daily Report. He read from Rosa's current file. Administered modified version of compound LK-47 at 0800 hours. Cognitive function remains within acceptable parameters, but subject continues to exhibit memory fragments from pre-treatment period. Recommend increasing dosage or implementing surgical memory interruption. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what they were reading. Rosa's memories of her family, her previous life, her very identity were being systematically erased and rebuilt according to the researcher's specifications. Every day brought new chemical assaults on her consciousness, designed to transform her into whatever psychological profile the experimenters required. Daniel found a maintenance corridor that provided access to the residential units without triggering the main security systems. The route required crawling through ventilation shafts and utility spaces, but it offered their only chance of reaching Rosa without alerting the security teams that were already sweeping the upper levels. "The boots we heard," Marcus said, monitoring the surveillance feeds. "They're not just looking for us. They're preparing to evacuate the subjects." On the screens, they could see personnel in hazmat suits entering the residential area with transport gurneys and medical equipment. The subjects responded to their arrival with the mechanical compliance of people who'd been conditioned to accept whatever procedures were inflicted upon them. "They're moving everyone, probably to another facility where we'll never find them." Marcus watched Rosa being led from her apartment by two technicians who handled her with the impersonal efficiency of people moving laboratory equipment. After 40 years of captivity, she was being relocated like a piece of experimental apparatus, her humanity reduced to whatever data she continued to generate for her captors. "We go now, or we lose her forever." They entered the maintenance corridor as alarms continued echoing throughout the facility. The ventilation system carried sounds from multiple levels, mechanical equipment being shut down, electronic systems being purged, and the systematic erasure of evidence that Project Mindbridge had ever extended beyond its official termination date. The shaft above Rosa's apartment was equipped with acoustic monitoring devices that had been recording her conversations for decades. Marcus realized that even her private moments had been invaded, her most intimate thoughts harvested as data points in whatever ongoing research justified her continued imprisonment. Through the ventilation grate, they could see Rosa's apartment being systematically stripped of personal items that had probably provided her only connection to sanity during 4 decades of captivity. Photographs, books, small mementos that might have helped her maintain fragments of her original identity were being collected and destroyed by technicians who worked with practiced efficiency. "She's in the hallway," Daniel reported, watching through another grate as Rosa was escorted toward the elevators. "If we're going to act, it has to be now." Marcus made the decision that would either save their aunt or get them all killed. He kicked out the ventilation grate and dropped into Rosa's abandoned apartment, landing hard on carpet that had probably been chosen for its psychological effects on the facility's prisoners. The apartment was sterile, despite its comfortable furnishings, every item carefully selected to create an illusion of normal life while serving the researchers' ongoing experiments. Even the books on Rosa's shelves had been chosen to study how different types of reading material affected her psychological state. Daniel followed him down, and together they moved toward the apartment's door. Through the peephole, they could see Rosa being led down the hallway by her escorts, her movements showing the careful control of someone who'd learned that resistance brought punishment, while compliance might earn small mercies. Marcus opened the door and stepped into the hallway, knowing that their presence would immediately trigger every security system in the facility. But the alternative, watching Rosa disappear into another 40 years of psychological torture, was unacceptable. "Rosa!" he called, his voice echoing off sterile walls that had contained decades of human suffering. She turned at the sound of her name, her eyes focusing on Marcus with an intensity that suggested her memories of family remained stronger than any chemical suppression her captors had achieved. For the first time in 40 years, Rosa Rodriguez saw hope walking toward her down a corridor that had known only despair. The encrypted hard drive felt impossibly heavy in Marcus's backpack as they raced through maintenance tunnels that Elena had somehow known would provide their escape route. Behind them, the sound of armed personnel grew louder, but the steel door they'd sealed with Rosa's help bought them precious minutes to navigate the underground maze. Rosa moved with surprising agility for someone who'd been imprisoned for 40 years, her knowledge of the facility's hidden passages proving invaluable. "They taught us emergency routes," she explained, as they crawled through a ventilation shaft barely wide enough for their shoulders. "In case of fire or structural collapse, they never imagined we'd use them to escape." The hard drive contained terabytes of data that Daniel had downloaded during their desperate minutes in the surveillance center. Decades of video recordings, psychological evaluations, medical experiments, and most damning of all, financial records showing how Project Mindbridge had been funded through shell companies and black budget allocations that continued to the present day. "How much did you get?" Marcus asked, as they emerged from the ventilation system into what appeared to be a natural cave that connected to the facility's foundation. "Everything I could access. Personnel files, subject records, correspondence between researchers and government officials." Daniel's voice carried grim satisfaction, including video conferences from last month discussing the relocation protocol we just interrupted. Elena had been right about the emergency exits. The cave system provided a route that bypassed all electronic security, emerging nearly a mile from their ranch house through an opening concealed behind overgrown brush. They'd escaped the immediate danger, but Marcus knew their real problems were just beginning. Rosa spoke for the first time since their escape, her voice carrying the careful control of someone who'd learned to guard every word. "They'll come for you now. Everyone who knows about the facility becomes a target for elimination or recruitment. There's no middle ground. Elena warned us about that. She said to trust no one except each other." Elena Vasquez? Rosa's expression showed the first real emotion they'd seen from her, a mixture of gratitude and residual fear. She was one of the few researchers who showed any humanity. She tried to minimize our suffering when possible, but she was part of the system that created our hell. They reached Marcus's truck as the sun set behind the Texas hills, painting the sky in colors that seemed incongruous with the horror they'd just escaped. Rosa climbed into the cab with movements that suggested decades of institutional conditioning, careful, measured, designed to avoid triggering punishment responses that might no longer be relevant. Daniel connected his laptop to the truck's power outlet and began examining the files they'd stolen. The scope of Project Mindbridge's continuation was staggering. Hundreds of subjects maintained in facilities across the country, ongoing research into memory manipulation and behavioral control. and applications that extended far beyond intelligence operations into commercial and political manipulation. "Look at this," he said, opening a video file dated 6 months earlier. The screen showed a conference room where men in expensive suits discussed quarterly progress reports with the detached professionalism of corporate executives reviewing profit margins. Subject: retention rates remain within acceptable parameters. One participant reported, "Memory modification protocols have achieved 97% effectiveness in preventing subject reintegration with previous identity structures. Recommended applications for witness protection and asset management programs show promising results." Marcus felt sick as the implications became clear. The psychological torture techniques perfected on Rosa and hundreds of other victims were being marketed as solutions for legitimate government programs. Witness protection participants, undercover agents, even political dissidents could be subjected to memory modification disguised as necessary security measures. "They've industrialized it," Rosa said quietly. "What started as crude experiments in mind control has become a sophisticated system for manufacturing compliant citizens. People who question authority, who remember inconvenient truths, who resist official narratives. All of them can be processed through facilities like the one we just escaped." Daniel scrolled through financial records that traced Project Mindbridge's funding through a web of defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and technology firms. The program had evolved from a Cold War intelligence operation into a multi-billion-dollar industry serving clients throughout government and private enterprise. "We have enough evidence to expose everything," Marcus said. "Congressional hearings, criminal prosecutions, international tribunals. This could destroy careers and topple administrations if we can stay alive long enough to release it." Rosa's institutional paranoia was well-founded. The headlights approaching their location belonged to vehicles that definitely weren't heading to neighboring farms for social visits. Marcus started the truck and drove toward town, hoping the public setting would provide some protection from direct confrontation. But the encrypted hard drive in his backpack contained information that powerful people would kill to suppress. And their brief moment of triumph was about to be tested by enemies with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. The first shots shattered their rear window before they'd traveled half a mile. The pharmaceutical companies are the worst, Elena continued, opening financial records that showed massive payments from major drug manufacturers to shell companies associated with Project Mindbridge. They use our subjects to test experimental compounds designed for memory suppression and behavioral modification. Drugs that will eventually be marketed for treating PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders. Marcus felt his understanding of the conspiracy deepen. The human experimentation wasn't just about developing intelligence capabilities. It was about creating commercial products that could be sold to an unsuspecting public. Rosa and thousands of other victims had served as unwilling test subjects for medications that would generate billions in pharmaceutical profits. "We need to contact journalists, congressional investigators, international human rights organizations," Daniel said. "This evidence could expose the entire network." "I've already begun that process," Elena replied. "But we need to coordinate simultaneous release through multiple channels. If we give them time to respond to limited disclosure, they'll activate protocols designed to discredit witnesses and suppress evidence." She showed them a communications plan that involved releasing different portions of evidence to 23 different news organizations, congressional offices, and international bodies within a 4-hour window. The coordination required precise timing and trusted contacts who could resist pressure to suppress their reporting. Senator Margaret Walsh has been investigating black budget programs for years, Elena explained. Representative David Kim chairs the House Intelligence Oversight Subcommittee Dr. Sarah Thompson at the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over crimes against humanity. If we can get evidence to all of them simultaneously, Rosa interrupted quietly, they'll kill everyone involved before allowing this to become public. You're underestimating their willingness to use violence. As if summoned by her words, the sound of vehicles surrounding the building filtered through the apartment's windows. Elena moved to a surveillance monitor that showed black SUVs blocking both ends of the street, while armed personnel took positions around the building's exits. "They found us faster than I expected," Elena said, her voice carrying the calm resignation of someone who'd always known this moment would come. "The evidence uploads are already initiated, but they need another hour to complete transmission to all recipients." Marcus looked at his aunt, freed after 40 years only to face recapture or death. "We're not letting them take you back." Rosa's smile held decades of suppressed defiance. "After what we've discovered, they can't afford to let any of us live." The birth certificates and adoption records spread across Elena's coffee table told a story that reframed everything Marcus thought he knew about his family's history. His hands shook as he examined documents that proved he and Daniel weren't just random victims of Project Mindbridge. They were the carefully orchestrated products of a multi-generational breeding program designed to study inherited psychological traits. "Your grandfather, Miguel Rodriguez, was Subject 01, Elena said, her voice heavy with decades of suppressed guilt. Not a farmer who bought land in Texas, but the first successful test case for long-term memory modification and behavioral conditioning. We needed to study how psychological manipulation affected subjects over their entire lifespans." Daniel stared at his own birth certificate, noting discrepancies in the dates and locations that he'd never questioned. "We're not really brothers. Genetically, no, but functionally, yes. You were both selected from children of previous test subjects, then placed with Miguel and his wife as part of an ongoing experiment in inherited trauma responses." Elena opened another file containing psychological profiles that reduced their entire family history to clinical data points. "Your parents believed they were adopting orphaned relatives. In reality, you were chosen because your biological families had shown specific reactions to our experimental protocols." Rosa watched this revelation unfold with the detached calm of someone who'd already processed her own identity dissolution decades earlier. "I wasn't really your aunt, was I?" "No, you were Subject 023, selected for your resistance to memory modification, and assigned a fictional family connection to provide emotional leverage over the next generation of test subjects." Elena's professional facade cracked as she continued. "We told Miguel that you were his sister to create artificial family bonds that we could exploit for research purposes." Marcus felt his sense of self crumble. Every childhood memory, every family tradition, every moment of love and connection had been artificially manufactured by researchers studying how fake relationships could be made to feel genuine through psychological conditioning. "The ranch," Daniel said. "Even that was part of the experiment," Elena nodded. "Placed above the facility so we could monitor how proximity to ongoing operations affected the psychological development of second and third generation subjects. Every family gathering, every holiday celebration, every moment of apparent normalcy was being recorded and analyzed. The documents included audio transcripts from family conversations that had been monitored through sophisticated surveillance, equipment hidden throughout their childhood home. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, arguments between their parents, all of it reduced to data about how artificially constructed family units responded to various forms of emotional manipulation. We studied how memories could be implanted across generations," Elena continued. "Whether trauma experienced by one family member could be psychologically transferred to others through careful manipulation of shared experiences. Your family became a laboratory for testing inherited psychological conditioning, Marcus. found photographs from his childhood that he'd never seen before. Images taken with telephoto lenses during supposedly private family moments. Pictures of him and Daniel playing in their backyard while researchers documented their behavioral patterns, looking for signs of inherited resistance to authority or unusual problem-solving abilities. Subject 0078 demonstrates exceptional psychological resilience inherited from subject 001, one research note observed. Despite artificial family construction, subjects have developed genuine emotional bonds that override programmed responses. Recommend studying this phenomenon for applications. In deep cover identity construction, the researchers had been frustrated by their family's ability to form authentic relationships despite the artificial circumstances of their connection. Love, it seemed, was more powerful than even the most sophisticated psychological manipulation, a discovery that had apparently prompted decades of additional experimentation. "Why are you telling us this now?" Daniel asked. "Why destroy the last illusions we had about our lives?" Elena's eyes filled with tears that she'd probably been suppressing for 40 years. "Because your capacity for genuine love, despite manufactured circumstances, is what made the experiments fail. The researchers could create fake families, but they couldn't prevent real human connection from developing. That failure is their greatest weakness." Rosa leaned forward, her institutional conditioning temporarily forgotten. "You're saying our love for each other is real, even though our blood relationships are fabricated." "More than real. It's proof that human beings can transcend any form of psychological control if they choose to connect authentically with each other." Elena gestured toward the surveillance photos and family records. "Every file documents their inability to break the bonds you created through choice rather than genetics." Outside, the sound of vehicles repositioning suggested their pursuers were preparing for a final assault. The evidence uploads were still in progress, but time was running out for Elena's coordinated revelation strategy. Marcus looked at Daniel and Rosa, not his biological brother and aunt, but people who'd chosen to love him and fight beside him despite the artificial nature of their relationships. "So we're not really family." "No," Rosa said firmly. "We're something stronger. We're family by choice, forged through shared struggle against people who tried to reduce us to experimental data. That's harder to break than any blood connection." The first flashbang grenade exploded outside their window. The corporate assassination contract lay open on Agent Harrison's tablet as he stood in Elena's destroyed safe house, his pale blue eyes scanning the legal language that authorized the permanent resolution of what the document termed information security threats. Marcus read over his shoulder while zip-tied to a chair, noting how efficiently bureaucracy could transform murder into administrative procedure. Meridian Resource Development has been granted extraordinary remediation authority under Section 7 of the National Security Protection Act, Harrison explained with the patient tone of someone conducting a routine briefing. "This includes elimination of compromised assets who pose unacceptable risk to ongoing operations." Daniel struggled against his restraints in the chair beside Marcus, blood trickling from a cut above his eye where Harrison's tactical team had subdued him. "You can't just execute American citizens because they discovered your crimes." "We're not executing citizens. We're terminating experimental subjects who were never officially alive, according to government records." Harrison scrolled through the contract, highlighting sections that detailed payment structures for different types of asset disposal. "Your legal identities were constructed as part of Project Mindbridge protocols. Technically, you don't exist outside the parameters of our research program." Rosa sat motionless in her restraints, her decades of institutional conditioning providing her with the emotional armor to remain calm while facing death. But Marcus could see the fury burning behind her controlled expression, 40 years of suppressed rage at the people who'd stolen her life and now planned to end it. Elena's Body lay beneath a blood-stained sheet in the corner of the room, a casualty of the tactical team's efficient assault on their position. Her sacrifice had bought them enough time to complete the evidence uploads, but her death left them without their most knowledgeable ally in understanding Project Mindbridge's full scope. Ms. Vasquez's termination was unfortunate but necessary, Harrison continued, consulting his tablet. Her unauthorized disclosure of classified information violated multiple federal statutes. The contract authorizes hazard pay for disposal of intelligence personnel, given their enhanced capability for evasion and resistance. Marcus felt sick reading the clinical language that reduced Elena's murder to a billing category. The corporate contract treated human assassination like any other professional service, complete with detailed specifications for evidence disposal and post-operation cleanup protocols. Meridian's Corporate Security Division maintains specialized teams for handling situations that require permanent solutions, Harrison explained. We've successfully resolved over 300 information security incidents without creating legal complications for our clients. 300 murders disguised as corporate problem-solving. Marcus realized they were facing an industrial-scale assassination operation that had been perfecting its techniques for decades. Elena's death was just another data point in their efficiency metrics. Daniel's voice carried desperate defiance. The evidence is already uploaded. Killing us won't stop the revelation. Harrison smiled with genuine amusement. Mr. Rodriguez, we've been monitoring your upload attempts since you accessed our surveillance systems. Every file you transmitted was intercepted and replaced with fabricated data designed to discredit any subsequent investigation. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Their desperate efforts to expose Project Mindbridge had been anticipated and neutralized by enemies who controlled the very communication networks they'd tried to use. Elena's carefully planned, simultaneous disclosure had become an elaborate trap. Congressional investigators will receive evidence of an elaborate hoax perpetrated by mentally unstable individuals with histories of substance abuse and psychological instability, Harrison continued. Journalists will discover that your supposed documentation was created using readily available video editing software. International human rights organizations will be provided with proof that the entire story was fabricated by domestic terrorists seeking to undermine government credibility. Rosa spoke for the first time since their capture, her voice carrying the hollow authority of someone who'd learned to speak truth in the face of overwhelming power. You can alter evidence, but you can't change what we've seen. Other people will discover the facilities eventually. Actually, we can ensure they don't. Harrison opened another file on his tablet, showing satellite imagery of construction vehicles surrounding the underground facility. Project Mindbridge assets are being relocated to more secure locations as we speak. The Texas site will be sealed and converted to legitimate oil extraction operations within 72 hours. Marcus watched video feeds of the facility being systematically dismantled. Heavy machinery removed equipment while hazmat teams eliminated any trace of the psychological experimentation that had occurred there. Within days, their ranch would show only the oil derricks and pumping stations that would provide cover story for the site's real history. The remaining test subjects, Daniel asked, transferred to other facilities where they'll continue contributing to our research programs. Your aunt's psychological profile indicates she could provide valuable data for another 20 years if properly maintained. The casual mention of Rosa's future torture broke something inside Marcus. He pulled against his restraints with renewed fury, knowing the gesture was futile but unable to remain passive while Harrison described decades of additional suffering for the woman who'd chosen to be his family. The contracts are already signed, Harrison concluded. Your termination will be completed within the hour, followed by evidence planting that will support the mental instability narrative. Project Mindbridge will continue operating with enhanced security protocols that make future exposure impossible. Outside the shattered windows, Marcus could hear construction equipment beginning the process of erasing their discovery from history. The investigative journalist's notes crumpled in Marcus's freed hands as he crouched behind the overturned table that had provided temporary shelter from the gunfire erupting throughout Eleanor's safe house. The handwritten research belonged to Rebecca Chen, whose byline he'd seen on dozens of articles exposing government corruption before her suspicious death in a car accident 6 months earlier. She was investigating sites in Nevada and Colorado, Daniel said, scanning Chen's meticulous documentation while automatic weapons chattered outside their position. Look at these connections. Shell companies, funding transfers, personnel movements between facilities. She'd mapped half the network before they killed her. Rosa moved with surprising agility despite her years of imprisonment, using furniture and debris to create improved defensive positions, while Harrison's tactical team regrouped for another assault. Her institutional survival instincts had been honed by decades of navigating threats that most people couldn't imagine. Chen discovered something they couldn't allow to become public, Rosa said, examining photographs that showed underground construction at multiple sites across the western United States. These facilities aren't just research centers, they're production factories for psychological control techniques. Elena's sacrifice had bought them more than time to upload evidence. Her final act had been to trigger a dead man's switch that simultaneously transmitted Chen's complete research archive to 47 different recipients across the globe. The investigative network Elena had cultivated during her years of gathering evidence was now activated by her death. Marcus found Chen's analysis of Project Mindbridge's international expansion, documenting facilities in countries that served as testing grounds for techniques that would eventually be applied to American subjects. The scope was staggering: psychological warfare operations disguised as humanitarian aid programs, memory modification techniques tested on refugee populations, behavioral conditioning protocols refined through collaboration with authoritarian regimes. She traced the funding back to pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors and technology firms that are household names, Daniel said, his voice filled with grim amazement. This isn't just government black operations. It's a public-private partnership for industrialized mind control. Chen's notes included encrypted communications between corporate executives discussing market opportunities for memory modification services, political opposition research, corporate espionage, witness intimidation, all transformed into legitimate business services offered to clients willing to pay premium rates for psychological warfare capabilities. Look at this client list, Marcus said, finding documentation that made his blood run cold. News organizations purchasing behavioral analysis of their own reporters, political campaigns buying voter manipulation protocols, corporations acquiring employee loyalty enhancement programs. The applications extended far beyond intelligence operations into the fabric of American society. Project Mindbridge's techniques were being marketed as solutions for human resource management, political campaign strategy, and media manipulation on scales that could influence democratic processes themselves. Rosa discovered Chen's final interviews with other investigative journalists who'd tried to expose similar programs. Each had died in circumstances that appeared accidental but followed predictable patterns: car crashes, home invasions, medical emergencies that occurred just as their research approached publication readiness. 23 journalists over 15 years, Rosa counted, all investigating different aspects of the same network. Chen was the first to realize they were all tracking pieces of the same operation. Outside, the gunfire had stopped. Harrison's voice carried through a bullhorn, offering negotiation terms that sounded reasonable until Marcus remembered the corporate assassination contracts that authorize their execution. We know you've accessed classified materials that compromise ongoing national security operations. Surrender voluntarily, and we can arrange protective custody that ensures your safety while we address the security implications of your discoveries. Daniel laughed bitterly. Protective custody in a facility like the one we just escaped. Chen's research included detailed analysis of how Project Mindbridge had evolved, from crude Cold War experimentation into a sophisticated system for social control. The techniques perfected on unwilling subjects were now being applied to entire populations through carefully orchestrated media campaigns, educational programs, and therapeutic interventions that modified behavior without the target's awareness. She figured out the endgame, Marcus said. Reading Chen's final analysis, mass application of psychological manipulation, techniques to create a compliant population that believes they're making free choices while actually following programmed responses. The dead journalist's notes described a future where democracy became an elaborate theater performance, with citizens voting according to psychological conditioning they couldn't recognize or resist. Political opposition would be neutralized through memory modification rather than imprisonment. Dissent would be treated as a medical condition, requiring therapeutic intervention. Sena's transmission worked, Rosa said, monitoring radio frequencies on a scanner she'd found in Elena's equipment. Multiple news organizations are already running preliminary reports. Congressional officers are demanding immediate investigations. International human rights groups are calling for emergency sessions. But Harrison's tactical team was preparing for a final assault that would eliminate the primary. Witnesses before their testimony could provide credibility to the emerging revelations. Jen's research would be dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of a disturbed journalist if no one remained alive to corroborate her findings. Marcus made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. We go public, right now. Live broadcast before they can stop us. He activated Chen's emergency communication protocol, connecting to underground networks of independent journalists who specialized in protecting sources from exactly the kind of corporate assassination teams now surrounding their position. The nuclear waste containers stacked in the facility's deepest level glowed with a malevolent green phosphorescence that made Marcus's radiation detector scream with electronic panic. They descended past level 7 during their desperate escape from Harrison's tactical team, following maintenance tunnels that Elena's stolen blueprints hadn't shown, only to discover that Project Mindbridge's darkest secret wasn't psychological experimentation. It was radioactive contamination that threatened to poison half of Texas. These aren't storage containers, Daniel said, examining the corroded barrels that leaked luminescent fluid across the concrete floor. They're disposal units for high-level nuclear waste from weapons testing in the 1960s. Someone used our facility as an illegal dumping ground. Rosa moved carefully among the containers, her institutional knowledge of the facility's layout helping her navigate the maze of radioactive debris. The psychological experiments were a cover story. The real purpose was hiding nuclear waste that couldn't be disposed of through official channels. The radiation levels were lethal. Marcus's detector indicated exposure rates that would kill them within hours if they remained in the contaminated area. But the containers were deteriorating rapidly, their contents seeping into groundwater that supplied drinking water for 3 counties surrounding their ranch. Look at these shipping labels, Marcus said, photographing identification numbers that traced the waste back to nuclear weapons facilities in Nevada and New Mexico. This material came from bomb testing programs that were officially terminated decades ago. Someone needed to hide evidence of contamination that exceeded safe disposal protocols. Daniel found documentation scattered among the containers, shipping manifests, disposal authorizations, and payment records that revealed a conspiracy involving the highest levels of the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Officials had authorized illegal disposal of radioactive waste by burying it beneath psychological research facilities that provided perfect cover for activities no one would investigate. The oil field was created to provide additional containment, Rosa realized, studying geological surveys that showed how crude oil had been pumped into the area to create a barrier between the nuclear waste and surface water supplies. But the containers are failing faster than they anticipated. Above them, the sound of Harrison's tactical team searching the facility grew closer. They'd followed the brothers' escape route into the lower levels, apparently unaware of the radioactive contamination that made their pursuit suicidal. Or perhaps they simply considered the risk acceptable, compared to allowing witnesses to escape with evidence of nuclear crimes. Marcus found the facility's emergency communication system and began broadcasting contamination warnings to local authorities. This is an emergency transmission. The underground facility beneath the Rodriguez Ranch contains high-level nuclear waste that is actively contaminating groundwater supplies. Immediate evacuation of the surrounding area is required to prevent mass radiation poisoning. The response was immediate and horrifying. Instead of evacuation protocols, Marcus heard Agent Harrison's voice override the emergency broadcast. Disregard previous transmission. Local authorities are advised that terrorist elements have accessed emergency communication systems to broadcast false information designed to create panic. Normal operations should continue while federal agencies respond to the security breach. They were going to suppress the contamination warning just as they'd suppressed evidence of the psychological experiments. Thousands of people would continue drinking contaminated water while officials developed cover stories to explain the cancer clusters and birth defects that would inevitably follow. They're willing to let an entire region suffer radiation poisoning rather than admit what they've done, Daniel said, monitoring radio traffic that showed no evacuation preparations. Despite the obvious contamination danger, Rosa examined the deteriorating containers with the clinical detachment she'd developed during decades of psychological torture. These barrels will rupture completely within days. When that happens, radioactive material will reach the main aquifer and contaminate water supplies for hundreds of miles. Harrison's tactical team reached their level, but the radiation detectors they carried began screaming warnings that forced them to retreat. Even with protective equipment, extended exposure to the contamination would be fatal. But their withdrawal was temporary. Marcus could hear them coordinating with hazmat specialists who could operate in the radioactive environment. Elena knew about this, Rosa said quietly. That's why she was so desperate to expose the entire program. The psychological experiments were horrible, but this is an environmental catastrophe that could kill tens of thousands of people. Marcus found Elena's final message hidden in the facility's computer system, a video recording she'd made months earlier when she first discovered the nuclear contamination. Her face showed the haunted expression of someone carrying knowledge too terrible to bear alone. If you're watching this, then I'm probably dead, and you've discovered what we really buried beneath that ranch, Elena's recorded image said. The nuclear waste disposal was authorized by officials who knew the containers wouldn't contain the material indefinitely. They accepted mass contamination as an acceptable risk to hide evidence of illegal weapons testing programs. The recording included evidence that current government officials knew about the deteriorating containers and had decided that concealing the contamination was more important than protecting public health. Corporate interests had calculated that cleanup costs would exceed potential legal settlements, making cover-up the most profitable option. Project Mindbridge continues because stopping it would require admitting the nuclear contamination, Elena's recording concluded. They can't acknowledge the psychological experiments without revealing the radioactive waste, and they can't address the contamination without exposing decades of illegal disposal practices. So they maintain both secrets while people die from exposure they don't know they're receiving. The facility's emergency systems began activating as the nuclear contamination reached critical levels. But Marcus knew the warnings would be suppressed, just like every other aspect of their discovery. The Senate hearing transcript lay open on the witness table as Marcus adjusted the microphone that would carry his testimony to millions of viewers watching the emergency congressional session. 3 weeks had passed since Elena's evidence uploads triggered the largest government scandal in American history, and the ornate hearing room buzzed with the tension of democracy confronting its darkest secrets. Senator Margaret Walsh, the Intelligence Oversight Committee chairwoman, reviewed her notes while news cameras captured every moment of proceedings that would determine whether Project Mindbridge's crimes would face justice or disappear into classified bureaucracy. Behind Marcus, Daniel and Rosa sat with the other survivors who'd been located and rescued from facilities across 17 states. Mr. Rodriguez, please state for the record how you first discovered the illegal operations beneath your family's ranch. Marcus began with their desperate search for water, describing how financial desperation had led them to dig deeper than anyone had attempted before. But as he spoke, he realized their discovery hadn't been accidental. Elena's posthumously released files had revealed that Meridian Resource Development had deliberately triggered the financial crisis that forced them to search for groundwater. The oil discovery was orchestrated, he testified. Corporate agents manipulated commodity prices and banking policies to ensure our ranch faced foreclosure, forcing us to attempt water drilling that would breach the facility's containment barriers. They needed witnesses to discover the site so they could implement relocation protocols for classified materials. Representative David Kim leaned forward from the committee panel. Are you saying the government deliberately exposed civilians to radioactive contamination to provide cover for moving illegal operations? Yes, sir. The radiation exposure was calculated to be non-fatal in the short term, while providing justification for evacuating surrounding areas during the evidence destruction process. Our family was considered acceptable collateral damage. Daniel's testimony revealed the scope of the psychological experimentation program, describing the residential areas where subjects like Rosa had been imprisoned for decades. His farmer's practical language stripped away the clinical terminology that had disguised torture as research, forcing the committee to confront the human cost of programs they'd unknowingly funded. Committee members need to understand that we're not talking about voluntary research participants, Daniel said. These were kidnapped American citizens, including children, who were subjected to experimental procedures designed to destroy their personalities and rebuild them according to government specifications. Rosa's appearance at the witness table created absolute silence in the packed hearing room. Her 4 decades of imprisonment had left her with an otherworldly composure that made her testimony even more powerful. She spoke without notes, recounting memories that psychological manipulation had failed to erase completely. I was taken from my teaching job in 1965 under the pretense of participating in a paid psychology study, she said. For 40 years, I was imprisoned in an underground facility where researchers used me to test memory modification techniques, behavioral conditioning protocols, and experimental drugs that were later marketed to the public as treatments for mental illness. Senator Walsh's voice carried barely controlled outrage. Ms. Rodriguez, during your imprisonment, were you aware that family members were searching for you? I was told that my family had been killed in the same car accident that supposedly claimed my life. The researchers used my grief over losing people I loved as a tool for psychological manipulation. Only later did I learn that my nephews were living directly above my prison, unknowingly serving as guards for the facility that held me. The committee had already heard testimony from Dr. Patricia Henley and Secretary William Crawford, whose video confessions Elena had recorded during her years of gathering evidence. Both officials had attempted to justify their actions as necessary national security measures, but their clinical discussion of human experimentation had only intensified public outrage. Marcus presented the financial records that traced Project Mindbridge's funding through defense contractors and pharmaceutical companies. The psychological techniques developed through torture of American citizens were sold as commercial products to corporations and political organizations. Memory modification services, behavioral conditioning programs, voter manipulation protocols, all marketed as legitimate business solutions. Representative Kim examined the corporate contracts that authorized assassination of potential witnesses. Mr. Rodriguez, these documents suggest that private companies were hired to eliminate American citizens who threatened to expose government crimes. How many people died to protect this program? Based on Elena Vasquez's research, at least 300 journalists, investigators, and potential witnesses were murdered over 15 years. The killing was outsourced to corporate security firms to avoid direct government involvement. The hearing room erupted as committee members struggled to comprehend the scale of the conspiracy. Project Mindbridge hadn't been a rogue operation conducted by isolated extremists. It was a systematic program involving the highest levels of government and major American corporations. Senator Walsh called for order as protesters in the gallery demanded immediate arrests of officials who'd authorized the program. Mr. Rodriguez, what outcome do you seek from these proceedings? Marcus looked at the senators who held the power to deliver justice or allow the crimes to disappear into classified secrecy. Complete exposure of all Project Mindbridge operations, prosecution of everyone involved regardless of their position or security clearance, and establishment of oversight mechanisms that prevent similar programs from operating in secret. The transcript would document whether American democracy possessed the courage to confront the evil that had been committed in its name. The whistleblower protection documents felt fragile in Marcus's hands as he signed papers that would theoretically keep him and his family safe from retaliation, though they all understood the limitations of legal protections against enemies who'd spent decades perfecting assassination techniques. 6 months after their Senate testimony had triggered the largest government reorganization since Watergate, they remained in federal protective custody while investigators attempted to dismantle networks that had operated in shadows for over half a century. Daniel paced the secure apartment's small living room, his farmer's restlessness aggravated by months of confinement in sterile government housing. 12 convictions out of hundreds of people involved. They're protecting the big fish while throwing mid-level operatives to the wolves. The prosecutions had followed predictable patterns. Lower-ranking officials and corporate contractors faced criminal charges, while senior administrators claimed ignorance of illegal activities conducted by subordinates. Secretary Crawford had negotiated a plea agreement that avoided prison time in exchange for cooperation that consisted mainly of confirming information already provided by Elena's evidence. Rosa sat at the apartment's kitchen table, working through psychological rehabilitation exercises designed to help her recover memories that 40 years of chemical suppression had damaged. Her progress was remarkable, but the therapeutic process revealed the true scope of what had been stolen from her. Not just decades of life, but the fundamental ability to trust her own perceptions of reality. The Foundation received another batch of applications, she said, reviewing files from survivors who'd been located in facilities across North America. 37 more families requesting assistance with medical treatment and legal representation. Most of them had no idea their missing relatives were still alive. The Rodriguez Foundation for Psychological Freedom had become the primary resource for Project Mindbridge survivors, funded by the oil money that had made their discovery possible. But the financial resources felt insignificant compared to the magnitude of damage they were trying to address. Marcus read reports from congressional investigators who'd discovered similar programs operating in allied countries. suggesting that psychological experimentation had become a global industry coordinated through international intelligence agreements. The American operations were just one component of a worldwide system for developing and testing mental manipulation techniques. "They're already rebuilding," he said, scanning classified briefings that described new facilities being constructed in countries with less restrictive oversight. Project Mindbridge officially ended, but the research continues under different names with private funding. The legal settlements provided financial compensation for identified victims, but money couldn't restore stolen decades or repair psychological damage that had been deliberately inflicted for research purposes. Many survivors struggled with integration into a world that had changed beyond recognition. During their imprisonment, Dr. Sarah Thompson from the International Criminal Court had initiated proceedings against American officials for crimes against humanity, but jurisdictional complications allowed most defendants to avoid international prosecution. The domestic legal system proved equally inadequate for addressing crimes that had been committed under the protection of national security classifications. "The media's already moving on to other stories," Daniel observed, watching news coverage that treated Project Mindbridge as historical scandal rather than ongoing crisis. "People want to believe this was an aberration, not evidence of systematic problems in how our government operates." Marcus understood the public's desire to treat their revelations as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of deeper institutional corruption. Acknowledging the full scope of Project Mindbridge's operations would require confronting the possibility that similar programs continued operating with improved security. Protocol's Agent Harrison had been convicted of conspiracy and murder, but his corporate employers had avoided prosecution by claiming they'd been deceived about the true nature of their activities. Meridian Resource Development had rebranded as the environmental consulting firm and continued operating with minimal oversight. The nuclear contamination beneath their ranch had been contained through an expensive cleanup operation that removed radioactive materials to properly licensed disposal facilities. But similar contamination at other sites remained unaddressed, hidden beneath layers of corporate liability protection and government classification. "Elena's final message was right," Rosa said, reviewing medical reports from survivors who continued suffering from experimental drug side effects. "Stopping the program wasn't enough. We needed to prevent them from starting new ones." The whistleblower protection agreements included provisions for ongoing security monitoring, but Marcus recognized the limitations of legal documents against enemies who demonstrated their willingness to murder witnesses. Their safety depended on maintaining public visibility and continuing to expose evidence that kept government officials accountable. "We can't protect everyone," Daniel said, acknowledging the harsh reality that many Project Mindbridge survivors would never be found or rescued. "But we can make sure the techniques they developed can't be used against future victims." Marcus looked at his chosen family, people who discovered that their relationships transcended the artificial circumstances of their creation. Their fight against Project Mindbridge had proven that human connection could resist even the most sophisticated psychological manipulation, but victory felt incomplete while the fundamental systems that had enabled such crimes remained intact, waiting for the next opportunity to sacrifice individual freedom for institutional power. The bronze memorial plaque gleamed in the Texas sunshine as Marcus read the inscription that would ensure future generations remembered the victims of Project Mindbridge and the cost of unchecked government power. 2 years had passed since their discovery beneath the ranch, and the land that had once concealed psychological torture chambers now hosted an educational center dedicated to preventing similar atrocities. In memory of the victims of Project Mindbridge and all who suffered in the pursuit of knowledge without conscience, Daniel read aloud as survivors and family members gathered for the memorial's dedication. May their sacrifice inspire vigilance against those who would sacrifice human dignity for institutional power. Rosa stood beside the plaque with other survivors who'd been located and rescued from facilities across the globe. Their presence testified to the international scope of psychological experimentation programs that had operated for decades under the protection of national security classifications. Each survivor represented dozens of others who remained missing or had died during their captivity. The memorial site encompassed the entire ranch, transformed from a working farm into an archive and research center that documented psychological manipulation techniques and educated visitors about the warning signs of institutional abuse. The underground facility had been preserved as evidence, its chambers serving as a museum that forced confrontation with crimes many preferred to forget. Marcus addressed the crowd of survivors, investigators, and family members who'd gathered to honor those whose lives had been stolen for psychological research. We're here not just to remember the past, but to prevent similar programs from operating in secrecy. The techniques developed through torture of American citizens continue to be used around the world, often with the cooperation of democratic governments that should know better. The Rodriguez Foundation had identified similar programs operating in 17 countries, each one using slightly different methods, but pursuing the same goals of developing behavioral control techniques for intelligence and commercial applications. The international network of psychological manipulation had proven more extensive and resilient than anyone had initially understood. Daniel announced the establishment of an international monitoring system designed to detect and expose psychological experimentation programs before they could victimize large numbers of people. We're training investigators in universities, human rights organizations, and journalism schools to recognize the warning signs of institutional abuse disguised as legitimate research. The monitoring network had already identified suspicious activities at research facilities in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, where political dissidents and ethnic minorities were being subjected to experimental psychological treatments that bore striking similarities to Project Mindbridge protocols. Dr. Sarah Thompson represented the International Criminal Court's ongoing investigation into crimes against humanity committed through psychological warfare programs. Her team had documented sufficient evidence to pursue prosecutions against officials in multiple countries, but jurisdictional challenges continued to protect many perpetrators from accountability. The memorial represents more than remembrance, Dr. Thompson told the assembled crowd. It's a commitment to ensuring that future victims have advocates who understand the sophisticated nature of modern psychological torture and the institutional systems that enable such crimes. Rosa had become the Foundation's primary spokesperson, her 4 decades of survival providing unshakable authority when discussing the long-term effects of psychological manipulation. Her rehabilitation had progressed remarkably, but she remained committed to helping other survivors navigate the complex process of reclaiming their identities after years of systematic mental abuse. Recovery isn't about forgetting what happened to us, she explained to families struggling to support relatives who'd been rescued from various facilities. It's about integrating those experiences into a broader understanding of who we are and what we're capable of overcoming. The educational center included exhibits that demonstrated how psychological manipulation techniques had evolved beyond intelligence operations into commercial and political applications. Visitors could see evidence of memory modification services marketed to corporations, voter manipulation protocols sold to political campaigns, and behavioral conditioning programs offered to educational institutions. Marcus found himself thinking about Elena's sacrifice as he watched young journalism students examining documents that exposed the interconnected networks of psychological warfare operations. Her death had triggered revelations that saved hundreds of lives and prevented expansion of programs that would have victimized thousands more people. Elena believed that sunlight was the best disinfectant. He told a group of investigative reporters who'd traveled from around the world to study Project Mindbridge's documentation. Transparency isn't just about accountability for past crimes, it's about preventing future ones by making institutional secrecy impossible to maintain. The memorial's most powerful component was a video archive where survivors shared their experiences in their own words, creating an unfiltered record of psychological torture that couldn't be dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. Each testimony added to a growing body of evidence that would make denial increasingly difficult for institutions that continued operating similar programs. As the dedication ceremony concluded, Marcus realized that their fight had evolved from personal survival into a global movement committed to protecting human dignity against institutional abuse. The memorial plaque would remind future generations that some discoveries carry responsibilities that extend far beyond personal gain. The time capsule rested in Marcus's weathered hands as he prepared to seal items that would help future generations understand both the horrors they'd uncovered and the hope they'd built from those discoveries. 5 years had passed since their desperate search for water had revealed the underground facility, and the Texas ranch now bustled with international visitors studying psychological manipulation techniques and learning to recognize institutional abuse. Daniel's daughter, 8-year-old Sophia, watched with the same intense curiosity that had once characterized her father's approach to farming. She'd grown up knowing the story of her family's discovery, understanding from childhood that some secrets were too dangerous to remain hidden, and that ordinary people sometimes had to make extraordinary sacrifices to protect others. "What are you putting in there, Uncle Marcus?" Sophia asked, using the honorary title that recognized chosen family bonds rather than biological relationships. The Rodriguez Foundation had taught her that love transcended genetics, that the strongest families were often built through shared struggle rather than shared blood. Marcus showed her Rosa's original teaching certificate from 1965, a reminder of the productive life that had been stolen through psychological experimentation. Beside it, he placed Elena's CIA identification badge, tarnished but still bearing, witness to a woman who'd chosen conscience over institutional loyalty when confronted with unforgivable crimes. "These belong to people who fought against forces much more powerful than themselves," Marcus explained. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth when everyone else wants you to stay quiet." Rosa joined them at the capsule, moving with the confidence of someone who'd reclaimed her identity after decades of systematic psychological assault. Her recovery had become a testament to human resilience, proving that minds broken by institutional torture could heal when given proper support and genuine love. "I'm including letters from the survivors," Rosa said, adding a thick folder of handwritten testimonies from people who'd been rescued from facilities around the world. Not the sanitized versions they gave to congressional committees, but the real stories of what we endured and how we survived. The international impact of their revelations had exceeded their most optimistic expectations. 17 countries had initiated investigations into psychological warfare programs, leading to the closure of facilities and prosecution of officials who'd authorized human experimentation. But victory remained incomplete, while similar operations continued in regions where oversight was minimal and human rights protections were weak. Daniel contributed documentation from the Foundation's ongoing work, including evidence of new psychological manipulation techniques being developed through collaboration between government agencies and technology companies. Social media platforms, educational institutions, and healthcare systems were being infiltrated by behavioral modification programs that made Project Mindbridge's methods look primitive by comparison. "The fight isn't over," Daniel said, placing his research beside the other items. "They've learned to be more subtle, to hide their operations within legitimate institutions, but the principles remain the same. Powerful people using psychological techniques to control others without their knowledge or consent." Sophia examined photographs from the memorial dedication, studying faces of survivors who'd traveled from around the world to honor those who hadn't lived to see their stories told. At 8 years old, she already understood that freedom required constant vigilance against those who would sacrifice individual dignity for institutional power. Marcus added his grandfather's fraudulent adoption papers, the documents that had revealed how their entire family history had been artificially constructed to serve psychological research objectives. But beside those papers, he placed photographs from recent family gatherings, images of chosen relationships that had proven stronger than manufactured ones. Future generations need to understand that families aren't just about biology, he told. "Sophia, they're about people who choose to love each other and fight together against forces that try to break them apart." The capsule included Elena's final message, the video recording that had exposed the nuclear contamination and revealed the full scope of crimes committed beneath their ranch. Her sacrifice had triggered revelations that saved thousands of lives and prevented expansion of programs that would have victimized entire populations. Rosa sealed the capsule with wax, bearing the Foundation's official symbol, an open eye surrounded by broken chains, representing vigilance against psychological manipulation and freedom from institutional control. The image had become internationally recognized as a symbol of resistance to psychological warfare. "When people open this 50 years from now, what do you want them to learn?" Rosa asked Sophia, recognizing that the child represented the future they were fighting to protect. Sophia considered the question with the seriousness of someone who'd been raised to understand the importance of bearing witness to injustice. "I want them to know that regular people can fight back against bad things, even when those bad things are done by powerful people who think they can't be stopped." As they buried the time capsule beneath the memorial plaque, Marcus realized that their discovery had come full circle. What began as a desperate search for water to save their failing ranch had evolved into a global movement dedicated to protecting human dignity against institutional abuse. The oil that had bubbled up from fractured Earth 5 years ago continued flowing, but its value paled beside the more precious discovery they'd made. That truth, however deeply buried, eventually finds its way to the surface when ordinary people possess the courage to keep digging.